Right, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Maxwell Okello. I'm the Chief Executive of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Kenya. It is really a thrill to see you join us this afternoon, and in big numbers, I must say, for this Women in Business Leadership Forum on inclusive trade for sustainability. So I welcome you all again, and thank you for taking your time to join us. Just real quick, in terms of run of show, our forum, our programming this afternoon will be 1.5 hours long. We will kick off with a keynote, some remarks, a keynote, and then a panel discussion that will feature a really great lineup of panelists that we have for you today. Thereafter, we will have a Q&A that will be led by the moderator towards the end of our program today. And so we encourage you to post your questions in the chat, actually not the chat, the Q&A tab as the session progresses. And so, like I said, we have a really great lineup of speakers today. And I want to take this early opportunity to thank one, Lisa Schroeter, Global Director, Trade and Investment, and Trade and Investment Policy at Dow, who is going to be our keynote speaker. Temitope Iluyemi, who is the P&G, that's Procter & Gamble, Senior Director, Global Government Relations for Africa. We have Margaret Mudeu, Regional Director for Africa at WeConnect International. We have Karen Sherman, Senior Advisor, Africa Women's Workforce Initiative, or AWWI. We have MaryAnne Mwaura, Senior Vice President, Public Affairs, East Africa at Citi, who's going to be our moderator for today. And lastly, and certainly not least, our wonderful AmCham Board President, Brenda Mbathi. So thank you all so much for accepting our invitation to participate, and we look forward to an insightful and engaging discussion. And so without much further ado, I want to turn it over to Board President Brenda Mbathi to give her remarks. Over to you, Brenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxwell. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, as we'd say, all protocols observed. And thank you so much for joining us for our 2022 Women in Business Leadership Forum. A very special thank you to all of our sponsors and our speakers today. We're really looking forward to an engaging discussion on the subject of inclusive trade and sustainability during this month of March, where we celebrate women. Despite great strides in economic growth and increased women in leadership roles in this region, there still remains significant gender gaps, which impede the pace of economic growth across East Africa and indeed Africa. Women continue to face differential barriers in access to markets, capital, capacity building, and even technologies, not to mention the underrepresentation in decision-making spheres at all levels. Here in Kenya, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics estimates that only 30% of Kenyan SMEs are owned by women. It is also estimated that gender inequality costs the sub-Saharan Africa region $2.5 trillion of its total human capital wealth. Gender equality in trade and business has the potential to create great economic gains for countries. For example, closing earning gaps between men and women on e-commerce platforms is estimated to add nearly 1.5 billion to the value of the African e-commerce market. But the question remains, how do we get there? Granted, there are many approaches that can work together to achieve equality, but a recent joint report done by the World Bank and the WTO titled Women and Trade, the Role of Trade in Promoting Women's Equality, highlighted that just as trade had been the engine of poverty reduction, trade also has the potential, with the right policies, to provide the engine to reduce the gender gap. And this same thinking is why we at AmCham Kenya developed the Women in Business Leadership Platform to facilitate dialogue and spearhead thought leadership on possible solutions to enhance women's inclusion in business leadership and trade. In honor of International Women's Month, today's forum will unpack what businesses can do to break the bias by spearheading inclusive trade through diversification of supply and value chains, private-public partnerships, and policy changes to enhance the participation of women in international trade. So I wish all of us today a great and insightful forum. And to get us started, I now wish to introduce our keynote speaker. Lisa Schroeter is the Global Director of Trade and Investment Policy for the Dow Chemical Company. She oversees the global function and cross-business priorities for the global trade agenda, as well as developing strategy on the international aspects of key corporate issues. Based in Washington, D.C., her responsibilities focus on trade policy and legislation, trade negotiations, and investment issues that foster growth in Dow's global businesses through identification of policies facilitating market access and reducing global distribution costs. Lisa is currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's the president of Women in International Trade and a board member of the Washington International Trade Association, the U.S. Council for International Business, and the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. She also serves as the chair of the ICCA Trade Network and Global Regulatory Cooperation Task Forces, as well as the U.S. Business Committee of the Transatlantic Policy Network. That's quite a mouthful, Lisa. You are totally accomplished. We are so honored to have you today. Let me warmly welcome you and hand this over to you. Thank you.
Brenda, thank you so much. And as you can clearly hear from the bio, I have trouble saying no to people, but I have to say this is an absolute honor to be able to join all of you today for this discussion. While I wish we were all able to be in person, hopefully we are moving to a time when that can happen soon. And in the meantime, I particularly want to thank the AmCham and all the sponsors for pulling together this discussion. Because Brenda, as you were just describing, and with the great efforts the AmCham is already making, what I'm thrilled to hear is that we are having these conversations now about not just why it's important to focus on women's economic empowerment, but what are we going to do about it? It's really time, it's past time that we're moving these conversations from why it matters to what's the agenda and where are the specific areas that we can work together to really achieve a meaningful difference. And I look forward to a very engaged panel discussion exactly on those next steps. It is a no-brainer. Women participating in the workforce, especially as we all look to come out of the incredibly difficult times we've gone through in the last two and a half years, and where we're still seeing so many challenges in the world, the more we can create opportunities, the more we can create growth, grow not only our economies and our communities, but the next generation. And that just makes sense in this day and age. Inclusive trade should be creating opportunities for everybody. Even globally right now, women have just set in by survey, I think by the World Bank, women have just 75% of the legal rights afforded to men, and 40% of countries still have laws that restricts women's participation in the labor force. We need to focus on where can we find those empowering policies that are going to make a difference. And that's the first topic that I'll speak to. From a policy angle, trade policy truly can be inclusive. For all the reasons cited in that World Bank WTO report, we need to start diving in on exactly how we make that happen. The WTO started this conversation back in December 2017, where at the joint event with the G20 on the margins of the WTO's 11th ministerial conference, 118 WTO members and observers endorsed the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. It's a great document laying out a number of principles by which we could seek to make progress, moving more women into the workforce, creating those opportunities. But that declaration itself is not enough. Now we have to think about the actionable agenda. And some of the areas where even at a WTO level and in the Women's Empowerment Ministerial Statement that they made back last winter, they started to identify some of those areas. There are real gender disconnects in trade policy. Tariffs are one of the greatest examples. Women's textiles, jeans, for example, even women's denim jeans tend to have higher tariff rates than men's jeans. To be candid, I don't see that much difference in those denim fabrics. So the more we can look at how tariffs themselves, the products that either women are making or buying, needing to move other countries, how do we make sure that those tariff rates are fair? How do we make sure that trade facilitation, which is a commitment made at the Bali Ministerial in 2015, the trade facilitation agreement committed countries to moving forward on national programs to make trade facilitation customs more efficient, making sure that there's a gender lens on that, so that as we're thinking about how those programs, licensees, progress, documentation works, more women are able to become importers and exporters when the trade facilitation system is transparent and clear. And the WTO has always obviously focused for quite some time on digital trade policy. And digital, the access to technology has the opportunity to truly empower women, become much more not only greater producers, manufacturers in their own right, but greater exporters by having access, whether it's digital technologies or financial services, having access to the necessary tools to turn themselves into global entrepreneurs. And we see where many of the members of the WTO are going even further. Canada, for example, not only having added gender diversity as a component of their trade agreements, but what I think is particularly impactful is ensuring that there's a measurement focus to that. It's not just putting the commitments into the agreement and walking away, but following up to demonstrate the economic value created by having more of a gender diverse approach, which incentivizes countries to be more committed. When you see the return of having more women in the workforce, the GDP numbers, economic growth and diversity in your economy, that gives you even more incentive to make sure that it truly happens. Here in the United States, and many of you may have participated recently, I think in last week's Trade Wins Summit over in Dubai, it demonstrates where the US Department of Commerce is committed to what they call welting, which is about women's empowerment through legacy, trade, and investment. And that's not only discussing the policy elements and trade strategies, but it's truly bringing women together across the business community. Even in virtual, I know there have been a number, including with Nairobi, virtual coffees, where women in different business communities can talk and share their challenges, as well as some of the lessons learned and skills that help us all grow. And that's the second topic that I'll mention, partnership. How we do more to share, just as AmCham is doing with their women's empowerment initiatives, how we do more to share those core skills and build up skills facilitation so that more women can be not only active in the workforce, but successful. I know I'm very proud as a former president of Women in International Trade and now chair of the WIT Trust. I'm thrilled that we have the great partnership with OWIT, the Organization of Women in International Trade in Nairobi, where OWIT is a great example of where it's both about policy development, but personal development too, and how we're sharing skills. That's where we see programs like She Trades with the International Trade Center. She Trades is a really good example of where they've created an online toolbox where you can have workshops with women in various communities and talk through what are those necessary skills, how you learn how to handle everything from banking to contracts to licensing to export certification, to be able to grow your own programs. And even I'm honored to say within Dow, a lot of focus is on women's empowerment, but particularly how we help grow our own workforce and create opportunities. Our EMEA, the Europe, Middle East, Africa, and India Female Sponsorship Program, really speaks to that. Not only how do we help women join the workforce, but be successful, creating opportunities through sponsorship, not just mentorship, but genuine sponsorship, where you've got colleagues willing to share their knowledge, their lessons learned from a leadership standpoint, and to create opportunities for growth in a career, particularly moving into where we're mentoring each other in terms of creating coaching, opportunity for sponsorship, and particularly ways to continue to develop and elevate your career. And that's the last topic that I'll mention. You know, I call it promotion, but what it really is about is how we are helping one another. OWIT Nairobi is a great example, including having hosted the Global OWIT organization a few years ago at a conference, bringing women together so that we can share the experiences of our own careers in a way that empowers each other. Australia is a terrific example of this as well. Their Champions for Change program, it's a terrific example of where they've actually looked at our allies, how men can be champions for change by ensuring, for example, you know, things that you would think would be obvious and simple. You know, don't accept panel requests unless there's gender diversity. You know, so many of our CEOs get asked to speak all the time. You know, just that mention that I'll do this, but I want to make sure that there are women included too, starts to make that not just an aberration, but a much more commonplace activity. And we can all do that for each other. One of the reasons that I have been such a fan of so many of the examples I've talked about today, but in particular, when you think about women's networks and Women in International Trade, our WIT DC group and the broader OWIT umbrella is a really good example. You know, it is about women coming together both for personal and professional development. And we can all be doing that for each other. Yeah, I joke a lot that one of my favorite tricks, and you'll hear me do it on the panel today, is how we make sure that we're reinforcing each other. When you think about not just your own career growth or your own opportunities for economic empowerment, but when you look around the table and think about each other, making sure that your other women colleagues, friends, partners, neighbors on the table get heard. You know, make sure that you're reinforcing each other's voice. And that's going to give us a great opportunity to not only share skills, build confidence, but to create pathways for women to be more involved and to have that confidence to seek their own economic opportunities. So I know we're going to have a fantastic panel discussion today, and I very much look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts on how we take this space that we know we are committed to, but really think about what is the actionable agenda we're all going to be taking forward when the panel ends and as we go into the rest of our workday. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that. And in the spirit of reinforcing, being a marketer, I took the 3 Ps out of that keynote: policy, partnerships, and promotion. So thank you very much for that. And we can go straight into the panel. So I'd like to invite my the panelists onto the forum. Great. Great. So Karen is in, Margaret, excellent, fantastic. So welcome to this wonderful session. And to start us off, I'd like to start with my fellow Kenyan, Margaret. Margaret, you're the current regional director for WeConnect International, and you're responsible for outreach, establishing connections, and supporting your existing and new members and women-owned businesses. Now, back to the topic of trade. How can trade expand women's role in the economy, decrease inequality, and improve women's access to skills and education? So the question to you, Margaret, is how can we reduce the complexity of international trade to provide more opportunities for women-owned businesses and to spread innovation?
Thank you so much, MaryAnne, for that question. Really glad to be here. And speaking of WeConnect International and membership, I'd first of all say thank you to some of our members, member buyers represented here, Doe, Procter & Gamble, and Citi, for the support you've given us. On to your question, I think access to information on markets and networks where available trade opportunities for women-owned businesses to take advantage of is very key. In today's economy, less than 1% of procurement spent by large corporations, like just some of those that I've mentioned, and government and many of the suppliers is earned by women-owned businesses. And this means that women are excluded in the economy in which they participate, and of course, influence a lot. For example, they influence up to 85% of all the purchasing decisions in household, which means that they cannot participate fully in the economy. And I'll give an example of how at WeConnect International, we do to help women access this very important information on where trade opportunities or procurement opportunities are available for them to take advantage of. We do have this platform where we have the suppliers who are 160 buyers from across the globe, and 14,000 women-owned businesses that are registered onto our platform. And this is an example of how access to information is made possible for these women to be able to trade. This is a platform where our buyers post the RFPs or requests for proposals and business opportunities where the women can access. And I think once we close that gap, especially on access to information, then we help these women get onto the journey to participate fully in this economy, where, as Brenda has mentioned, 30% of women-owned businesses in Kenya are owned by women. And you can imagine even the figures that she was breaking down. If these women are empowered and through access to information on these opportunities, then they will be able to, in return, invest in education to make sure that their children access the best, access the best education, they have the best nutrition and healthcare that they can afford. Secondly, I think women-owned businesses, giving them capacity, especially to export market readiness, or even trade information, or even on how to be procurement ready, to trade across borders, whether in person or even online. And we have seen a lot of that happen, especially with the ongoing pandemic. And this brings me to the point of having the right digital skills, which will give these women boldness and resourcefulness to resolve problems on a local and a global scale. We have seen how a lot of them have had to adopt digital transformation so that they are not left behind and they are able to participate fully. And of course, this is another key thing at WeConnect International, where we're very keen on building capacity of these women to make sure that they are included in this trade. And where else to get this information other than from the global buyers that are part of our network. Like, we do have a program with Procter & Gamble, for example, that takes these women through their academy on how to do business internationally, how to do business with multinational corporations, what is required in terms of compliance. And on our end, we do have certification to show that these are women business enterprises, which gives them greater credibility and attractiveness even to global buyers. Last and not least, another thing would be to establish and to implement gender responsive and ethical procurement policies and practices within organizations. Most multinational operations and even local organizations are looking at creating that gender balance, especially in the workplace, which should also reflect in their procurement processes to ensure that they include women so that they have a diverse pool of suppliers. They have increased competition and also innovation from these women that are keen to do business with. And as an organization, we provide thought leadership in that particular area, especially to organizations that are keen on sourcing from these diverse suppliers, which are women-owned businesses, so that they can be very conscious. And of course, this information, trickling down the information of gender-inclusive sourcing to their procurement teams as well, to ensure that they include women, they consider women, and they understand what it means to give business opportunities to women-owned businesses. Thank you very much.
Margaret, thank you so much for really outlining, the opportunities that are out there and the kind of organizations that you have been working with. And I'm sure there'll be many more who might also on this call want to sign up and understand what is going on in that space. Fantastic. So as we move along, I'd like to direct my next question to Karen Sherman. Karen, you have spent your time in Africa, advocating for women's rights around the world too, in your 30+ years career in global development. You are currently on Africa Women's Workforce Initiative to transform the African workforce by building a talent pipeline of women from the margins in Africa that US and other companies on the continent can employ. That's, like music to my ears. From your experience, what is the role of public-private partnerships, many people know it as PPPs, in driving both entrepreneurship and employment? Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, MaryAnne, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel today, and I apologize in advance. It's 5 a.m. in Portland, Oregon, so it's super early here, hence the dark background. But so let me just say that I think that public-private partnerships are absolutely critical, both for employment and entrepreneurship. But I'm going to start first with the employment side of things, which is what the Africa Women's Workforce Initiative, or AWWI, is focused on. And I'm going to say something that may be a little unpopular here, given the topic of our panel today, which is that the majority of women that I have worked with from rural and vulnerable communities, especially in complex environments around the world, prefer stable work over entrepreneurship. Because it is inherently less risky, at least initially, and they can often earn more to support themselves and their families. And this is really one of the main insights of my work over the years, is really understanding the motivation for women to seek employment or to start and grow a small business. Where women are often marginalized and excluded, and we've heard that from our speakers already today. And in my experience, it's really that motivation, the chance to build a better life for themselves and their family, which is a key driver. And I think in terms of designing policies and programs, meeting women where they are versus where we want them to be or think they should be is fundamental to any kind of policy making that we would want to engage in. For AWWI, it's why our focus is wanting to build a substantial pipeline on the continent that companies, particularly American companies, but companies more broadly, can engage with both for employment and partnership. And we see that there are many potential benefits for this. And I think about programs like AWWI, and I should mention that it is Google funded. This is a new initiative that's funded through their Impact Challenge for Women and Girls. And it's going to be operational for about 3 years, but really to provide proof of concept about what it can do to be able to start in East Africa and expand across the continent. I'm really excited to see what the potential is. But for companies, we see this opportunity as private sector forward. So instead of thinking about the supply of women who need skills and training, we're starting with the demand, which are the companies themselves, and really understanding what their pain points are in terms of creating opportunities for skilled employees, what's missing, where are the skill gaps, where can we step in to make sure that they are ready to step into valuable opportunities there and start their entry-level journey on the employment track. And I think a program like this can really help to build America's brand and visibility across the continent. And obviously for women, the formal employment creates an opportunity both for to start getting a job, earning more money, allows them to recover from the pandemic. We know that many, many, many women lost their jobs, lost their businesses over the course of the pandemic. So this is an opportunity to start recovering that and really contribute to lifting their families out of poverty, and also to helping their economies and societies recover. And we also know that jobs can often be scarce in very difficult environments, and even more so during the pandemic. And so women also have competing domestic responsibilities that may prevent them from seeking formal employment. So we know that women often start small businesses because it's the only way to earn a living. And we talk about these as being entrepreneurs out of necessity versus opportunity, or both, not necessarily mutually exclusive. But we also know and have heard from some of our speakers today that women often lag behind men in starting those businesses in terms of access to skills, markets, capital, technology, trade partners, et cetera. And so we really focus at Aquila on making sure that we are building those connections for women at all levels, but also working on the mindset to approach those opportunities. And there's a lot of research to suggest that the socio-emotional skills are as important as the business skills in terms of helping entrepreneurs to be able to succeed. But just to get back to our topic even a little bit on the importance of public-private partnerships and entrepreneurships, there's some wonderful examples about how companies specifically can be driving the skill building in areas like e-commerce, trade, supply chain, logistics, etc. And we have worked with UPS in areas like that too, where they're really working to build up that pipeline of women who they can work with down the road as future supply and value chain partners. And again, that's probably where I'll end, which is to say that thinking about women as supply, value chain, and trade partners, not as an afterthought, but as a deliberate and consistent policy for companies, I think is a critical means to drive entrepreneurship on the public-private partnership side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Telling it as it is, that not many women are actually, there are some women, let's put it that way, that find entrepreneurship a risky business, as it were. And staying on that topic, then I would like to go direct my next question to Temitope. Temi, you are the Associate Director, Global Government Relations Africa at P&G. Now, talking about research that the ladies have been referring to, the World Bank Group, the Women in Trade role of trade in promoting women's equality, it marked the first major effort to quantify how women are affected by trade. Now, likewise, we know the AFCTA report, making the Africa Free Trade work for women and youth, which recognized the need for concrete policy measures and investments to ensure that women and youth, who account for the majority of the population, business owners and workforce, are better integrated into the value chains, jobs and opportunities stemming from the Africa Free Trade. So the question to you is, how will the inclusion of gender provisions in trade agreements impact women in trade?
Thank you very much, MaryAnne, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So, I mean, there have been a lot of discussions even already about the benefits of trade with women and how women are disproportionately impacted. But, you know, before we talk about some of these, some of the impact that trade policies can have on women's participation, let's examine some of the challenges that women really face in trade. Some of them have been mentioned already today, but they sometimes face, barriers that are quite disproportionate to that of men. For instance, access to finance, access to credit, even, issues with complying with onerous regulatory procedures across, cross-border, for instance, poor access to information is part of it, exclusion from male-dominated distribution networks. The fact that women often are the caregivers at home also poses a time restriction and mobility restrictions on women. And as we have seen also from the World Bank and WTO reports, they also have a higher risk of exposure to abuse, corruption, and harassment at the borders. Again, a lot of this is stemming from socio-cultural norms in society where, for instance, inheritance rights, women are denied inheritance rights. And as such, this already sets them up for the lack of access to finance when you don't have collateral, for instance, to put forward for credit in a basic financial environment. This definitely, these sorts of socioeconomic norms limits women's access to resources that could otherwise have enabled them to grow in trade. We've also seen a lot of statistics that also show that a lot of women are employed in the trading sector, especially in import and export communities. Now, when they also lack access to these inputs, in training is also part of them, access to information. It's estimated that the female-led SME industry face a credit gap of about $300 billion. So these are huge gaps, that prevent women from contributing and getting the main big benefits of participating in trade. I often also say that every form of exclusion has economic consequences. You all will probably be aware of the McKinsey report that says that we can add $12 trillion to the global economy just by closing or advancing gender equality at the same level as several developed countries. And the number goes up to $25 trillion when you really do maximize the opportunity. Now, as some of it has been said by some of my other co-panelists here, increasing women's participation in trade also helps us to close the pay gap, close the gender equality gap, but also empowers women economically such that they have access to more disposable income to take care of their families, their communities, and particularly promote education. We all know that an empowered woman definitely will encourage her children to go to school, will encourage her community to go to school. There's an overall effect on the community by empowering women economically. Now, Margaret had talked about some of the partnerships that we have with WeConnect. There's a lot that P&G is doing in this respect as well. So, for instance, apart from providing training and technical assistance to women-owned businesses, again, we put our money where our mouth is, and we have made an intentional declaration to double our spend with women-owned businesses over the next 3 years. So this is an intentional objective or a strategy for us to, one, include more women in the global value chain, empower them, and then ensure that we can continue to close that gender gap or that gender disparity as much as possible. So I mean, there are several studies. There was also one that I saw with the OECD that also talks about the gap between men and women-owned businesses employed in the export sector. So it's a 27% versus a 37% of men. So imagine the kind of opportunities that we can optimize with women just by closing that gap and creating more opportunities for women to participate in trade. Now, you also talked about the AFCFTA. Again, being intentional, just as the private sector is being intentional in including and driving women's participation in trade as well as the global value chains. We cannot reap the full economic benefit of any country, if we continue to exclude women, or they are less empowered than their male counterparts to optimize the opportunities that exist in trade. Over many centuries, women have often, even if you look at traditional farming institutions where the men go to farm, women have often had the role of trading the goods that have been produced in the farm. So women have often been, long in trade, and I would say they are probably more attuned to getting trade across, even more than men. Again, we see several tariffs on women's products. I'm sure you've heard about the pink tariff, and the example set here is, for instance, the apparel industry, where obviously a lot more women are employed than men. And, given the pandemic, there has been a significant impact or hit on the apparel industry, meaning more job losses for women. And, also many of these industries have been classified as sensitive in many countries with, higher tariffs. Again, this is putting a higher tariff on articles that are more important to women. Obviously we use more apparel than men do, and we engage more in the trade of apparel. So we talk about this pink tariff, but I want to even extend that, to even other products. Look at consumer products. There have been other studies as well that shows that, like for like, if you take the same item for a man and a woman, let's use deodorant as an example, it costs more for the woman to buy a tube of deodorant than the deodorant that is designated for men. So several areas of disparity in the social sector. And I always like my favorite example, because we do produce sanitary pads, and we know the effect of the lack of access of sanitary pads on girls. In many countries, for instance, condoms are given free, and we cannot give sanitary pads free. Sanitary pads, this is a product that actually addresses a biological process that you can argue that is uncontrollable in women, and whereas you can argue that on the other side, maybe it's controllable to an extent. So we need to look at it holistically. And like I said, I'm very happy that the World Trade Organization and other trade agreements that are being developed, like the AFCFTA, have actually captured within it, intentional gender clauses that will enable women trade more productively and more progressively. So, like for instance, the WTO Joint Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment aims to increase women's participation in trade. So we need to continue in this trajectory to continue that more women own businesses and more women are able to participate in trade. So it takes both the public and the private sector to actually capitalize on the opportunity, the gap that we have, close it, and ensure that we all develop.
Wow, thank you very much, Temitope, for that explanation. And in fact, the pink tariff actually was something that I only learned this year because of having to prepare for this. So you can imagine sometimes a lack of information drives that policy change. I remember in our own country here in Kenya, we had a similar situation, and it needed for the female MPs to explain, to the men, you're the ones who are buying these things at the end of the day. So it actually impacts you. So sometimes it's about how we tell our stories. And sticking to that now, we can come back to our keynote speaker, Lisa. Listening to all the panelists, how would you rate and compare the progress that has been made so far against international benchmarks? What are some of the best practices that could really drive further participation of women in the manufacturing sector? And what stands in the way of that implementation?
And that's such a great question. And it really demonstrates what I love about the panel. What you've heard from all of us here today are real examples, the kind of public-private partnerships that Karen was talking about, and how we can do more to upgrade the skills that, for many of us, and I know every single one of us, especially the companies, have very strong commitments around STEM education, for example. And I can freely admit to this as someone who barely made it through high school chemistry. A lot of us as young women, we're not pushed to be good in the science and maths, even if we like it. And creating that opportunity, how we're focusing more on building these skills. The Temitope mentioned a second ago too on supplier diversity. That is such a great example of a very tangible element that companies can contribute to by creating training programs, doing a broader outreach to a much more diverse supplier community, but not only as a way of providing the information, also demonstrating the skills required. What are the standards by which you become part of our global value chains? That's an incredible opportunity to raise the level of a lot of local women-owned businesses in terms of, committing. I know a lot of us are focused on ESG commitments these days. It's how we create opportunities for women to demonstrate how they're meeting those high standards of environment, health, safety, labor, and workforce, and that they're really earning. This isn't just creating a window or checking a box on a certain number. They're really earning that right to be part of anybody's supply chain. So I think the more that we can focus on how we're taking a lot of these programs, but just like we're doing on this panel, we have the opportunity to share those best practices in a way that creates opportunities to further scale. We're doing something very similar. Dow's the U.S. chair of the U.S. Brazil CEO Forum right now, which is actually a government-sponsored policy discussion. But one of the elements the companies wanted to focus on was education. We all have these great programs, but instead of taking each program in its own little silo, how can we combine these efforts in a way that maximizes or scales up that impact so we're reaching more, especially young people? And I think when we look at a lot of these benchmarks, you just have to look around in your own communities and see, where do you see that excitement, especially from young women, being able to take on any area of opportunity here, not just the traditional gender roles that they've grown up with. How are we creating that? How are we giving them that access to all opportunities, not just a limited set? And it comes straight back to, how are we helping make sure they have the skills personally and professionally to be able to take that on?
I really like that there's ownership also on our part and also as a collective. Thank you very much, Lisa, for that. I'd like to, at this juncture, ask if there are any questions. And I'm sure there are some people who are still warming up, which is great. We still have some questions to go, but you can post them on the Q&A session. And of course, if you want to ask your question, live, please let us know on the chat, and we will ask you to direct your questions. Thank you. Okay, so going back to our discussion on inclusive trade for a sustainable tomorrow. My next question is to Karen. How can we reach stakeholders that have been sidelined for too long? For example, the economically disadvantaged women and youth.
No, thank you, MaryAnne. First of all, I think this is such a valuable discussion, and I really, sorry to bring us back to this, but I loved the comparison between condoms and sanitary pads. I think that was such a great analogy, and I'd never thought about before, but that image will stay with me for a very long time. And it's a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about, which is this fundamental inequality that we don't even think about, that just becomes part of the norm because we accept it, because nobody's challenged it. So, which is exactly what you did. But I think just to bring us back to that, we all share the same goal, which is women's economic participation. That is where we're starting from at all levels of society and the economy, because we know that that's a game changer for women and their families and communities when women are actively involved in the economy and creating more opportunities for them to do so. And we're particularly by broadening this base of stakeholders to include women from the margins. I just think that's so important, because sometimes we focus on the elite women, or the women who have had the opportunity through education or through connections or through other means to pull themselves up and to reach this point in their careers, which is terrific. But there's so many women that I think we're still leaving behind. And it's why I focus a lot of my efforts in really trying to meet women where they are. And again, if that's employment, if that's entrepreneurship, either one of those is really valuable, and creating that pipeline for them to really connect with the workforce in any way possible. But I think some of the things that you've already heard today is just making sure that we're really focused on gender balance when we're talking about business development services, training, and capital. That is fundamental. And I think making sure that when we're talking about training and business skills, that we're also thinking about soft skills too. I think what you were saying too, from an education standpoint, really helping to think about that. entrepreneurial mindset from the very beginning, and not when women have graduated or they've dropped out of secondary school or they're looking for a job, but thinking about it from the very beginning. The same way that we're starting to think about STEM. Allowing young women to think about what's possible from the very beginning of their education and not at the tail end when they're really struggling to support themselves and their families. And then I think some of the things that WeConnect us so well is just really building peer support networks and reinforcement for women entrepreneurs and helping them to work through those pain points at a micro level and at a policy level, and making sure that they're part of a broader ecosystem that supports their economic development as entrepreneurs and as employees. And then I think finally, and most importantly, as it relates to this panel, really this whole deliberate and consistent inclusion for women-owned companies, particularly in the micro to small area for value, supply, and trade opportunities, and making that an intentional part of policy and strategy for so many companies operating on the continent.
Thank you very much for giving us the macro stakeholder engagement policy there. So I want to bring it to a micro level, and since we are many corporations here, Temitope, this one is for you. What is the role of multinational corporations such as GE, such as P&G, such as Citi Bank, in spearheading inclusive trade through diversification of their supply value chains?
Thanks again, Margaret. As multinationals operating across the continent, our values actually behooves us to engage in our communities and leave them better than how we met them. And when issues like gender equality is a main issue in the communities where we operate, it is important that we engage and we bring in our best practices from the various countries where we're already present and try to support the communities in which we operate. We have the weight to influence, Force for Good programs that can actually elevate women in the various societies that we work in. So providing technical assistance to women-owned businesses through agencies like WeConnect. We also do a number of programs also with UN Women. So we have the way to actually drive the change that we need to see in several of our communities. Beyond working with these agencies, we also have the wherewithal to engage with policymakers and drive the change where it's really, where it can really be broad-based. So for instance, when we're talking about trade agreements or regional integration across board, one of the critical challenges that we have in Africa is standards harmonization. So we have various standards across the different economic communities across Africa, which the agreement like the AFCFTA aims to correct. But playing our own part in providing technical assistance and guidance within various committees that define these standards harmonization process is critical. I mean, we have roles that we've played in bigger unions like the EU or even with the FDA in the US. We bring these practices to bear in the countries where we operate. So we are members of various communities. So for the AFCFTA, I think is called the African Organization Standards, the ARSO. We have a key role in this committee, providing technical assistance, on various topics, on various technical topics on standardization. So these are some of the things that we do, and other multinationals can do as well in playing a part in, ensuring that the environment, we can create a more level playing field for both men and women to operate effectively on the continent. I also talked about, we've also had partnerships with UN Women. We call it the Women Entrepreneurship Development Program, where again, we train women-owned businesses on the various skills they need to advance their businesses and integrate in global value chains like ourselves. Oftentimes, we run competitions, to make it engaging, and we offer grants to some of the most successful women-owned businesses. often also offering them internships or observerships, with some of our more established businesses. Now, again, I cannot overemphasize the importance of policy. So policies in the private sector as well as in the public sector. So again, we all know that women have been burdened disproportionately with the burden of childcare and household care, which often goes unpaid. Domestic work is not valued, but then this restricts the time they have to participate in economic activities. So we advocate that more men take part in domestic activities to ensure that women who are skilled enough can contribute their utmost to economic activities, thereby helping to uplift the community overall. So these are very important. And we have implemented certain policies like what we call the parental leave policy, where we give 8 weeks to all parents, all birth parents. And of course, we give up to 6 months maternity leave to birth mothers to recover. We have seen some countries also repeating this and actually making it national policy to give extended paternity leaves to men, enabling them to also to participate in more domestic activities and freeing up eligible and skilled women to be able to contribute their best also to nation building. When we ran a survey in our operations, and when you ask people, what would you like to do if you had extra time? Everybody, male and female, said they would like to spend more time with family. So if indeed this is true, then it is important both at public sector level and at private sector level to create an environment that enables this engagement to happen so that we can bring up more wholesome families and make it a norm that everybody contributes to housework and everybody can also give their best to the economy. These are just some of the ways in which multinationals can play a role. Thank you.
Temitope, you were so convincing that as you were speaking, Felicitas Obonyo of Syngenta asked to find out how they could participate with the WeConnect with some of the women programs. So if there's at least one thing you did today was to do that connection, thank you so much. And I also do want to give a shout out to Nyabura Bogwa for your questions, and we'll come to them. And I want to also encourage other people to send more questions through. So Margaret, you seem to be the person who's being looked at right now. So what can be learned from existing interventions that have sought to promote more gender inclusive outcomes in trade? How have the lessons learned helped in creating a sustainable and economically empowering space for women? Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much for that question. So I'd like to touch on gender bias. I think one thing we do have as an organization is that we get to work with the buyers and the suppliers, and we get to hear the stories of women-owned businesses of how when they seek business opportunities, they're turned down because they're women, or someone shows up to a boardroom and the next thing they're asked is, where is the CEO of this organization? Because they cannot believe that a woman-owned businesses can be a business leader and have the capacity to do business with even large organizations and corporations. And I think thought leadership is very vital, especially to organizations, so that they get to understand what gender inclusive sourcing means to their own business, so that as they include more women in their procurement process, then we get to see that more women are involved and that bias is eliminated, and women are seen as capable business leaders who are able to also provide services and provide goods that organizations need. So through the 10-year period that we have existed as an organization, we have seen that providing thought leadership and making these key connections, especially when we get to bring together the women-owned businesses and the buyers together in a room where they get to talk, get to hear about how the procurement processes go, like what are some of the challenges that women-owned businesses face, especially when they are seeking for business opportunities. And on the other hand, when it comes to the buyers, like some of the categories that they're very keen on sourcing from. And we know that there is a misrepresentation of women-owned businesses in specific sectors like technology. So we are also very keen to make sure that we look for these women so that they are part of our community and they have the visibility they need to have to the buyers so that they are able to source from them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'd like to take this to turn it a little bit and go back to, policies. And this question is for Lisa. What are your thoughts on the worker-centric trade agenda of the Biden administration that infer that trade policies must consider their impact on women, among other factors?
Great question. And it's going to build on what Temitope was talking about as well, because it's a fantastic opportunity. I mean, trade, from my perspective, trade has always been about building the workforce, but this is a great way of really bringing that out and making sure that that's very much the public discussion around this too. It shouldn't be just about, being able to get fruits in wintertime you can't grow for yourself. That's a great element of trade policy, but it's not what's going to make the long-term difference. And it's not what's going to create those economic opportunities, particularly for women to be more engaged. So having that kind of thoughtful approach is really helpful. But I think especially as we lay that out, we've talked a lot about the different policy areas that matter. The access to information, trade facilitation, customs processing, where are the access points that are fair and equitable for women in that process? We talked about the pink tariff. Why on earth should women's products be discriminated against, especially when we're driving so much of the economic activity we're buying for households? Why should we be paying an additional tariff to do that when we're supporting communities? How do we ensure that digital trade provisions go through, not just so that countries are looking at that in terms of how to get more investment from the tech industry, but how are they ensuring that there's access to digital services so that women can expand their businesses beyond their neighborhood to source an entire market, a country, another continent? The more we take that gender lens across these policies, the more we're going to get to, where we get that gender blind approach, where we're really thinking about how everybody gets empowerment. It's not easy, but I think it goes back to what you said a little bit ago too, MaryAnne. We need to be putting our story better together. We need to be sharing, and I will freely admit I'm with Karen. The condom sanitary products, that example caught my attention, and it'll catch everybody's attention because it is tangible. These are products we're all familiar with, correct? So the more we can really make this, and as we said at the outset, how we take a high-level principles discussion and we boil it down to those very specific examples where I think our policymakers can better understand. Particularly in the window of opportunity that we have now. As trying as the last 2.5 years have been, everybody is starting to look at that. Majority of the planet anyway at the moment has the opportunity to look at how we move forward. And to move forward, we need everybody to have that opportunity, or we are not going to be able to recover. We have a lot of challenges to deal with, and supply chain is the perfect example. Logistics dislocation at the moment is tremendous. And instead of just trying to sort of band-aid with our usual networks, there's the opportunity here to broaden out and work with more creative, innovative partners like women-run businesses that can help us bridge the gaps that exist in supply chain and continue to drive that economic recovery. So I think it comes back to how do we bring that story forward in a way that is tangible, but also pragmatic enough to demonstrate, particularly for policymakers, if you make this change, we're going to be able to do X. These are where the benefits lie. The more we make that real, the more we make change happen.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And what's interesting, now that I'm seeing the questions coming through fast and furiously, please send them through again, ladies and gentlemen. We have some a really good audience with us. And now we've finished the formal, planned questions. And now I want to address the Q&A section of this panel and webinar. I think the first question I will take is actually from our host, Maxwell Okello, and I want to direct it to Karen. Why? Because it's something that you stated around that, we are being presumptuous that all women actually do want to start their own businesses, but yet they prefer to be in employment. So Maxwell's question is the entrepreneurship challenge. What do you think can be done to get more women to venture not only into business, but also into sectors that are not traditionally women oriented? We're talking about STEM, but also infrastructure development. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, MaryAnne. It's such a good question too, and I think so many times women go into businesses that are sort of familiar to them, things that are very much related to their personal experiences, and you would understand that, right? Something that but I think the more that we can push women, that maybe push is the wrong word, encourage women to move into areas that may be considered non-traditional, like STEM is for women still in many parts of Africa, the better it will be. And I think a lot of it has to do with exposure early on, the same way that we were talking about STEM. Having spent 17 years working in Rwanda, it's so clear to me that some women have never touched a computer before, and if there is one computer in the classroom, it's the men who get to play with the computer. And so many young women have been discouraged from pursuing opportunities in STEM, and I would say even in things like infrastructure development. So I think exposure early in school and through out of school programs is really important. And then what I was saying earlier about how companies, and this goes to public-private partnerships, how companies can engage through their workforce, through their experiences, to educate and train young women on what the opportunities are in things like infrastructure development. And I think when women know what is possible, I think it will make a huge difference in terms of moving women into non-traditional sectors.
Thank you. Actually, someone else sent a similar question, so I think we've dealt with that. Unless someone else wants to chip in into that, what their thoughts are. Lisa?
Yeah, actually, just maybe a quick and a tangible description of that. And I think it goes to some of the questions that are coming through about women supporting other women. And I fully agree with everything as Karen was just saying. Exposure is key. I think a lot of us kind of go through school with a certain set direction in our mind, like I'm going for this job. And as we all know in the workforce, that's not the way it plays out. Life happens along the way. And I think the more we expose, especially young women, to that opportunity to look at the range of different, we've done this with the WIT Trust. We created, in the last 2 years, we've been doing these virtually a skills workshop. And we deliberately called it a skills workshop because what we've done is take 3 or 4 of the WIT women here in DC who work in trade, but in different areas, maybe the government or an embassy or a company. And when that panel discussion focuses around careers, but it's not a career session as much as it is about talking about the skills that have helped you be successful along the way. And many of those careers, many of those women demonstrate just the range of opportunities they've taken. Like we said, maybe they were in a law firm, or they were on the Hill, or they were in the corporate, or all the above. And one of the things that I've heard a lot of feedback from young women on is, well, I don't really want to go into trade. I don't want to be a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I've done trade policy for a really long time. You don't have to be, that narrow mindset. Instead, opening up, here's the range of things. Trade can be about development. It can be law. It can be government. It can be partnering with WeConnect. There are so many opportunities it creates if you have the right skills, communications, networking, research and analysis. How do we get more women thinking about what are those skills that help you do any job? And build that, get into the career path that allows you to be successful. So the exposure and the skills development are key.
Thank you very much. And actually, I do want to appreciate AmCham for this, because typically whenever we have women webinars, they are mostly focused to women in careers, yet we are also aware from the research, especially during the COVID era, where many people were thinking, what, can I start thinking about what other jobs, almost to what Temitope was talking about earlier, which is what other opportunities are there for me? And yeah, so actually my next question will be to Temitope, and it's directed to you. We're being reminded that, this is International Women's, the theme for International Women's Day is break the bias. And so what are some of the strategies that women can use to remove their own biases you know, and of course, against themselves. So a woman to herself and women to women. Thanks, Temitope.
Thanks, MaryAnne. And I really do believe that, you know, the UN couldn't have picked a better theme for this year's International Women's Day. It's all about bias. Everything that we've been talking about is all about breaking mindsets and ensuring that we are intentional in driving the culture that promotes inclusivity, you know, across various sectors. So, I mean, we all have biases, you know, like you said, we have biases even against ourselves. I've heard women, you know, talk about, you know, being offered opportunities which they felt they were not ready for, whereas your male counterpart who has 10% of your qualification will tell them he can do that and more. Women need to put themselves out more there, you know, be ready to raise up your hands. You know, you don't have to tick all the boxes and get all the qualifications. You know, like Lisa said earlier on as well, you don't have to necessarily stay where you found yourself. You can broaden. It's all about the mindset. Broaden your scope, broaden your mind, and think about the possibilities. So we've been told different types of biases. So there's your bias against yourself, and then bias of women versus other women. Again, this comes from our social conditioning, from our cultural backgrounds. Many of these predetermined women's roles is a result of having grown up in patriarchal societies where women's roles are predetermined to be X or Y. So we as women also grow up seeing ourselves in that role and in that light. It has to be a conscious and intentional effort to break those biases of self and also of women versus women. You know, we also mentioned about women supporting other women is critical. You know, I've often, you know, when we talk about careers, let me digress a bit into careers. You know, we've heard women say, oh, like women bosses are difficult and all that. It's a mindset. I have to say that some of my best bosses in my almost 25 years of working have been women. You know, it's women, you find women who share your values, find women who are keen on supporting and, you know, promoting other women, and be one yourself. So as you advance, whether in your business or in your career, make sure that you're intentional about bringing the next woman along, creating that opportunity, that next seat for the next woman at the table, as we say. You know, for most of us at this level, it has to go beyond self. It's about ensuring that the next woman still has a role or a seat at the table. And, you know, unfortunately, that puts a lot of pressure on the women who are in some of these driving seats at the moment. But, well, that is the role that we have to play. A lot of us are here today because other women in the past, you know, took the stance for gender equality. Women today would not be able to vote, would not be able to drive if some other women in our past didn't take that stance for gender equality. So we must play that role for each other in whatever space. And there's no one that is too small, too junior, too anything to be supportive of the next woman. You always have something better than the other person, and there's always something that you can contribute. So if we go out with that mindset, definitely, you know, harnessing the power of women is something that we can use to change the world.
Harnessing the power of women, fantastic. And I want to go to the, yeah, even Lisa is clapping, I like that. Margaret, this one is for you. Actually, Nyabura literally should want to have a side chat with you, but I'll maybe ask the question because many other people might be interested in your response, which is, she wanted to know if the business supported, basically, which kind of organizations WeConnect supports. That's the first question in summary. And the second question she has is, now that we're in a digital era, are there provisions for training in marketing in this space? You know, we're talking about earlier about information and being able to upskill. Karen mentioned it. How does WeConnect support women in this space? Thanks.
All right, thank you for that question. For us, we support women-owned businesses that are 51% owned, managed, and run by at least one or more women, and in all sectors, right? And the reason why we say 51% is so that this woman may have, at the end of the day, the power to make the decision on how to invest the money they get at the end of the day from their own business. We accept all sectors, but of course, our member buyers are always keen on some sectors where they're not able to find women-owned businesses, like someone mentioned, in infrastructure, in technology, like in some of the non-traditional sectors where we are very, very keen and always building strategic relationships to get these women onto our network. So the second question, we are
digital.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Digital. Oh, I did mention that we do have various skills training programs that we run from time to time to empower these women so that they're able to do business with the buyers that you already have for them. And the platform that I did mention before is, as WeConnect International, we do have a platform we call WeCommunity, where our registered women-owned businesses and buyers are on the same platform. And this is a platform with 14,000 plus women-owned businesses from across the globe, and they have visibility to the 160 buyers who can reach out to the women and source out from whichever categories they see. And this does not limit the women from trading within themselves again. And on to a very interesting thing, on International Women's Day, we were running a challenge called Rise to the Challenge campaign. And I can say that 10 of our member buyers have collectively committed to source at least $22.4 billion in goods and services by 2025 from companies with diverse ownership with a focus on women-owned businesses. And you had Temitope mentioned that before. They are one of the 10 companies that committed, and we follow this through and ensure we measure and they walk the talk that for the commitment that they made. Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying how you support women and how they can actually plug into your network. Maybe because I come from the financial sector, I'm surprised that I've not received any question with regards to, knowing that one of the bottlenecks that is seen to be, it could be a bottleneck, and I'm waiting to hear from, one of you about funding, access to funding in particular. Any insights that you could give, maybe I can direct this to Karen, about how women can plug into the financial sector and what kind of gender lens is required for financial institutions to ensure that they support women. I hate the word help, support women to actually grow in their businesses.
Thanks, MaryAnne. There are, I don't know if you've heard, there's a lot of movement around gender lens investing going on right now, and really trying to move the dial in terms of the same way that we're talking about trade and sourcing and supply and value chains, but really helping investors to think about how they put women forward in terms of the companies that they're investing in, because we know that women are really lagging behind in terms of access to capital, and capital that might be, particularly when you're talking about small and micro businesses, patient capital that will really work, again, meeting women where they are, not where you want their businesses to be. I have talked to so many impact investors over the years, and what I find is, the word impact is kind of a sexy word, but a lot of them just have the same kind of, we want a profitability horizon of, 24 to 48 months, and we want double-digit returns. And I think particularly at this level, and I saw one of the questions around marginalized women too, but particularly when you're talking about marginalized women or some of those micro enterprises, you really need to think about crafting investment programs that meet women where they are, and think about what that looks like to bring them along to higher levels of capital. And that takes some partnership, that takes some nurturing. And so I think helping investment firms to really think about how they're doing investing in a different way, and also even perhaps thinking about some set-asides for women to bring them up to a particular level through benchmarks and incentives.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And that question actually about the marginalized and women and people with disabilities came from Robert Mugo, and I really thank you for that question. Is anyone on the line who'd like to ask a question directly? If not, we will continue. I have seen a question with regards to how is Citi I'm not a panelist, but it is a question that's out there, so it must be to me, supporting women in business, especially startups, as this is where access to capital is a challenge. Great. At Citi, we are a corporate and investment bank in Africa. However, I like the word Lisa used earlier about partnerships. And so we've decided to do it in 3 ways. One is to work with Citi Foundation partners. For example, TechnoServe. They actually have a program with micro retail, in the micro retail space. And as you're aware, that's perhaps where many women are, in different countries, we call it different, dukas, mom and pop shops. And so I have seen a lot of transformation in that sector. And again, the upskilling, the training, even before funding, you will find that research also says, first, if you empower someone, the money will follow. Basically, that's the concept that has come through. And I think that's the theme that has come through this conversation. When people are upskilled personally and upskilled from a business perspective, financial management, how to run their merchandise, how to market, those kind of themes happen whatever industry, even in our own businesses. So that's one way we would do it. Secondly, we do actually have Citi Ventures, and that works primarily with, to hub or incubate companies. And again, Temitope is talking about, having challenges. Those are kind of some of the initiatives that we would have, because we would want to walk the journey. It's not just important to just give people money and upskill. It's also helpful to walk the journey with them. And then last but not least, we do actually work with financial institutions and have specialized programs within the FIs to work and give programs that on lend. So we work with, many of the organizations that are out there, many financial institutions, many micro lenders in this space. So there are many things that financial institutions can do from a macro level. But I think for this conversation, in terms of startups and having access to capital, there is a lot that is done there. But I think it's more about empowering women first, even before the finance that would follow through. But I would love to hear, that's my take. I would love to hear perhaps from anyone who'd want to, maybe Margaret, you are in the space, you would want to add some information.
All right, what I can add to what you said is that a lot of startups fail to access capital because there's not a lot of funding that is available for early stage, very, very early stage companies. And this is a gap that's there, that if we had a lot of players in that particular space, then they would help these small businesses unlock capital for the next level. That's why you hear a lot of investors saying that we have money available, but you cannot find good businesses to invest in. And you wonder, where is that disconnect? It's in the capacity of the small businesses, because some of them have funds to the tune of $1 million, and these are small businesses that do not have the capacity to absorb that kind of capital. So I agree with you, capacity building and also having players with very patient capital coming for the very early stage businesses to ensure that they unlock them to access the next level funding along the pipeline.
Thank you very much. And we have come to the top of the hour, and I would love to hear from you. This is the session where we just hear your parting shots, and especially in light of the full conversation. And I'll probably do this alphabetically, and starting with our keynote speaker, Lisa. What is your parting shot on this topic of inclusive trade for a sustainable tomorrow?
Thank you. My parting shot is a call to action. We've talked a lot about how women can empower each other. And I will admit, in the course of this conversation, my favorite note so far has been from my own colleagues in Elizalba in South Africa, who sent me a really nice Teams note that said, "Great job on the speech." That means the world to me, and it'll mean the world to the women that you know. So think about that. Think about a woman you haven't connected with in some time. And this is a call for our male allies on this call too. Send a note. Do a recommendation on LinkedIn. Think about a way to tell a woman in your life that she matters and she's impressive, and that will build on each other. So do it once and you'll realize what a great impact that makes. You can think about who else you can do that for too. So it's a call to action. Thank you.
Call to action well received. I'll do that for all 4 of you later on this day. At least let me take my own personal one and hopefully encourage someone else. Let me see if my alphabetical order is correct. Next, Karen.
Great. I love the call to action. I would also add deliberate and consistent. I think that when we're talking about how we engage with women on a variety of different levels, I think we need to be very deliberate. We could also use the word intentional and consistent, and I think that will help to move the dial.
Thank you, Karen. Intentional and consistent. I've written that down. Over to you, Margaret. Your parting shot.
All right, my parting shot is inclusive trade for sustainability is an action, is a call to action for each one of us to do whatever we can do to break the bias in our organizations in our own small way. We have had as women, how can we also support our fellow women by breaking that bias, even how we talk to ourselves as women, that we are capable, that we are empowered so that we can take on opportunities, whether it's employment opportunities or business opportunities. And for the organizations to ensure that they make a conscious decision to source from women-owned businesses, because it makes a stronger business case, not only for you as an organization, but also for our economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Over to you, Temitope.
So my parting shot will really be about ensuring that we actually live the theme of this year's International Women's Day and break the bias. Break the bias, in self, in others, in other genders as well, and everywhere that we see it. We need to challenge these biases whenever we come across them, and also be the voice for those who are not confident enough to speak up when these biases occur. So let's be a voice for other women. And then I cannot overemphasize the importance of mentorships of other women, women-owned businesses, women in careers, women at various levels. So let's continue to drive mentorships and be intentional about building our networks as women. It's something we don't do very well enough, and which the men have perfected. We invite all our male advocates to join us as well in building up other women. Doing business with women is really good business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Temitope. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a wonderful time of insights, of engagement with all of you. I really appreciate you making time to listen to this session organized by the American Chamber of Commerce here in Kenya. To Maxwell and his team, we thank you so much for making time for us and giving us this wonderful theme of inclusive trade for a sustainable tomorrow. And last but not least, to all the audience who are here, what is your call to action? We'd be really glad to know what is your call to action. We are not a talk shop. We are putting our actions into space, whether you are an organization, how you're going to link up with companies organizations such as WeConnect. How can we learn from each other? How can we help? How can you break the bias for yourself? And how can you break the bias for other women? It's been wonderful being your moderator. I'm MaryAnne Mwaura, and I would like to hand this over to our host, Maxwell Okello. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for what has been a really, really edifying session. I've come out with so much from this session, and I believe I speak on behalf of several who've joined this call. We take away, that enthusiasm, and speaking as a man, I think this really behooves us as men to really affirm, support that mental displacement that was talked about. I think we have a role to play in that, and just be able to drive the women within our own circles to do more and to be confident in themselves. And so I just really want to thank all of you, Lisa, Karen, Margaret, Tope, MaryAnne for an excellent job of moderating the panel, and Brenda as well for getting this going for us. So I want to wish you all a wonderful day ahead. For those who have just started their day, for those who are ending their day in East Africa and the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, I wish you a wonderful evening. So thank you, and God bless you all. Bye-bye.